The year is 1235. The palace of Karakorum is alive with the sounds of preparation. The low drums of ceremony, the calls of servants moving through stone corridors, the whisper of silk being arranged for the 5th time. In a dim chamber overlooking the central plaza, a young woman sits motionless on a low bed. Her name is Altan, and she is 16 years old. Her hands have been bound loosely with white silk, not to restrain her, but to keep them still, to preserve the elaborate henna designs applied that morning. She is not permitted to touch her face, her clothes, or anything else. The room smells of smoke, sandalwood burning in a brazier, and something else beneath it. Sweat. Her own, perhaps, though she cannot move to verify it. Through the latticed window she can hear the voices of men discussing her future in tones of matter-of-fact authority. Her uncle, the Khan's representative, a scribe recording the terms. Altan has been taught since childhood not to listen to these conversations. Women do not ask about such things. Her role is to exist quietly, to be beautiful on demand, to understand that her life is not hers to direct. She is still wearing the clothes of her father's house, a deal of deep crimson with borders of gold thread, the traditional dress of Mongol nobility. By evening, she will wear the clothes of her husband's house. By evening, she will belong to another man entirely. By evening, she may no longer be called Altan. Many wives are renamed by their husbands. She has been told this is normal. She has been told she should feel honored. The thought of a new name fills her with a quiet terror she cannot speak aloud. Her mother came to her chamber at dawn and held her face in her hands for a long moment without speaking. Not angry, not sad, simply present and then absent. Her mother, who married at 18 into a rival clan and has not returned to her birth family in 12 years. Her mother, who now has 4 children but refuses, in Altan's presence, to speak of her wedding night. The silence between them that morning was heavy with meaning. Altan understood it meant, this is how the world is. You cannot change it. You can only survive it. Outside the window, the plaza has begun to fill. Horses are being dressed in colored silks. Musicians are gathering with their instruments. Altan's father will gift the Khan's representative with horses, gold, and her. The Khan has decided that an alliance with her father's clan, one of the great tribal confederations of the Western Steppes, is more valuable to him than the 300 horses and the rights to water sources that would have been negotiated as the bride price. So, Altan is the true gift. The true treaty made flesh. She is the seal on a contract that will bind her father to the Khan's service for years, perhaps for the rest of her life. She thinks of her younger brother, who was asked this morning if he would like to come to the ceremony. He said yes, without hesitation. He will sit among the men and watch. He will see his sister handed to another man, the way a merchant hands over a bolt of cloth or a set of furs. And he will think nothing unusual of this. This is how the world works. This is how empires are built. Women are distributed. Men make decisions. Power flows like water to where it needs to go, and women are simply part of the landscape it crosses. Altan closes her eyes. She can hear the Khan's representative laughing in the courtyard below, a deep, satisfied laugh. She can hear her father's voice, warm and proud, joining in the laughter. She can hear her future husband arriving, the thunder of his horse, the greetings, the settling in for the ceremonial feast that will last long into the night. She can hear everything, but understand nothing. The sounds are happening to someone else, not to her. In this moment of helpless clarity, she does not know that she is not alone. Across the Mongol Empire, in palaces and in conquered cities from the Pacific to the Black Sea, thousands of women just like her are being fitted for their final dresses, being reminded not to weep, being prepared for a future they neither chose nor can refuse. This moment, her moment, sitting in the dark with bound hands, is not a single tragedy of individual circumstance. It is the machinery of empire grinding forward. It is policy made visible in her trembling hands. What you have just witnessed is not invention. It is not legend. It is history, documented, layered, and verified across sources that span continents and centuries. The moment we described, the system that produced it, the women trapped within it, all of these are real. What happened to Altan and thousands of women like her is recorded. It survives, and it demands to be seen. We know the names of some of these women. We have the marriage records, scrolls of silk and paper, carefully maintained by Mongol administrators that list the transfers of noble women between families and territories as officially as one might list the movement of horses or weapons. We have the royal genealogies, meticulously tracked because the legitimacy of the Khan's dynasty depended on knowing exactly who was related to whom through which women's bodies. We have the Yassa, the Mongol legal code, which explicitly regulated the marriages, property rights, and status of noble women across the empire. These laws did not hide the system. They formalized it. We have the accounts of witnesses who walked through Karakorum's palaces and recorded what they saw. We have the chronicles of Rashid al-Din, a Persian historian and administrator who served the Mongol Khans directly and wrote extensively about the imperial court and the place of women within it. We have the travel records of Marco Polo and other European merchants who visited the Khan's holdings and described the ceremonies of marriage, the transfer of women, and the hierarchy of wives within noble households. We have Chinese official records from the Yuan dynasty, the Mongol dynasty that ruled China, which document the marriages of Mongol princes and the appointment of imperial consorts. We have archaeological evidence from the ruins of Karakorum itself, the remains of the compounds where these women lived, the chambers where they were confined, the inscriptions and artifacts that hint at their existence. We have fragments of letters, some dictated to scribes by women who could not write, that reveal in careful language the shape of their lives and the cost of their circumstances. We have anthropological studies of steppe culture and tribal practice that provide context for these marriages and help us understand the logic, the deliberate, calculated logic that justified them. From all these sources emerges a single unavoidable truth. This was not chaos. This was not the random cruelty of individuals. This was policy. The Mongol Khans did not hide these practices because they were not ashamed of them. They were openly discussed as state strategy. They were recorded as official business. They were celebrated as the means by which an empire extended its power and cemented the loyalty of its far-flung regions. The story of Altan and the thousands of women like her is the story of how an empire organized the most intimate aspects of human life, love, sex, reproduction, identity itself, to serve the expansion and stability of its political power. But why did this system exist? To answer that question, we must understand the world that produced it. Long before the Mongol Empire unified the steppes, the nomadic peoples of Central Asia had practiced a form of diplomatic marriage. Among the tribes and clans that roamed the grasslands, exchanging women between groups served a practical purpose. It created kinship bonds, prevented blood feuds, and secured alliances without requiring the massive expense of military campaigns or the destructive cost of endless conflict. A marriage between the daughter of one tribe and a leader of another could secure years of peace and mutual protection. In this context, the exchange of women was a rational tool of statecraft. But when Genghis Khan unified the fractured Mongol tribes in the early 13th century, He inherited this tradition and transformed it into something far more systematic, far more ruthless, and far more integral to the functioning of his empire. The Mongol Empire was not a traditional state with clearly defined borders, a central bureaucracy, or a unified administrative system like China or the Islamic Caliphate. It was a confederation of territories held together by military force, family loyalty, and a carefully cultivated network of obligations. Genghis Khan had conquered vast territories by defeating rival clans and forcing them to acknowledge his superiority. But conquest alone was not enough to maintain power. He needed to ensure that the conquered territories remained loyal, that local leaders did not rebel, and that the empire held together across the vast distances of the Eurasian continent. Marriage became one of the most effective tools for achieving this. When a noble woman from a conquered or rival family was married to a loyal general or to another clan within the Khan's network, she became a living bond between two groups. She was a hostage, ensuring that her birth family would not rebel. She was a conduit for the Khan's influence, extending his power into regions he could not directly control. And her children would be half-siblings to the children of other noble families, creating a web of kinship that tied the empire together. The Yassa, the legal code that governed the Mongol Empire, made this system explicit and formal. The code classified women, particularly noble women, as distinct categories with different legal and social status. A woman of the Khan's family had different rights and restrictions than a woman married into the Khan's service. A woman transferred as part of a political alliance had different status than a woman born into a household. The Yassa regulated marriage, inheritance, and property rights with remarkable specificity. It stipulated that women could, in some circumstances, retain control of wealth or property. But it also stipulated that a woman's fundamental loyalty, her reproductive capacity, and her person belonged to the authority that controlled her. The law did not use the language of slavery, because noble women were not technically slaves. But the reality of their legal status was remarkably similar. They could be transferred, reassigned, or claimed by the authority that held power over them. Consider what a noble marriage meant in practice. When a girl was born into a great family, she was born with a specific political value. Her beauty, her health, and her family connection were assets to be calculated and deployed. As she grew, her father or uncle would consider which alliances would most benefit the family. When she reached adolescence, sometimes as young as 13 or 14, she might be betrothed to a man she had never met in a territory she had never visited to serve the political interests of her birth family. She had no role in this decision. Her consent was never sought because it was assumed that obedience was her duty. Once the marriage was arranged, she was transferred like any other valuable commodity. The ceremony might be grand and public, with gifts of horses and gold, but it was fundamentally a transfer of control. Her father's authority over her was ended, and her husband's authority began. She became part of her husband's household, subject to his will, and available to serve his political purposes. But the system extended beyond simple marriage alliances. The Khan and members of his family held the right to demand access to noble women outside of marriage. A powerful man might summon a married woman to his bed for a night or a season. The woman's husband could not refuse without risking his position, his wealth, or his life. These encounters were euphemistically referred to as honors. The honor of serving the Khan, the honor of bearing his children. In reality, they were coercive sexual encounters justified by the authority of the state. The children born from these unions, if they were acknowledged, became part of the political landscape, creating new networks of power and loyalty. The women bore the knowledge of their violation in silence, because speaking of it would be to challenge the Khan's authority, which was unthinkable. What made this system so powerful, what made it so difficult to resist, was that it operated simultaneously on multiple levels. At the level of immediate power, the Khan's will was law, and refusing meant death or the destruction of your family. At the level of family honor, a family that refused the Khan's demand for a marriage alliance would be branded as disloyal, and their lands might be seized, their men executed, their name erased from history. At the level of religious and philosophical justification, the Mongol system incorporated Buddhist, Islamic, and traditional shamanic beliefs that all, in various ways, reinforce the idea that women's primary purpose was to serve the stability of empires and the continuation of bloodlines. A woman who resisted her assigned role was not simply being disobedient, she was acting against the cosmic order itself. And at the level of simple economic necessity, noble women, like all women, had limited options for survival outside the structure of marriage and family. There was nowhere else to go, no alternative livelihood, no refuge available to her if she fled. She was bound by law, by custom, by religion, and by economics. The system was complete. It left no space for resistance. Let us follow Altan through her first year of marriage, which is also her first year of captivity, though she has learned never to use that word. Her husband is Noyan, a general of middle rank in the Khan's service, a man of perhaps 40 years old who has been married twice before. His household is substantial, a compound near Karakorum with several permanent stone structures, quarters for servants and soldiers, stables for horses, and storage rooms for grain and goods. Altan's dowry has made him wealthier and more comfortable. He is satisfied with the arrangement. He has a young, beautiful, noble-born wife, whose father now owes him loyalty, and very soon, within months, she will give him heirs. Altan's days begin before dawn. A servant comes to her chamber, a woman perhaps 10 years older named Batu, who was herself transferred into this household years ago as a concubine and is now part of the permanent staff. Batu brings water, still warm from the hearth, for washing. She lays out Altan's clothes in a specific order. The undergarments first, then the deal, then the ornaments. There's a precise routine, and Altan has learned that deviation from this routine results in questions, concerns, and eventually punishment. Not dramatic punishment. Simply the small, quiet withdrawal of privileges. A meal served cold instead of warm. Permission to visit the servants' quarters withheld. Noyan's mood turning distant and sharp. The punishment is always calibrated to be just painful enough to ensure obedience, never so extreme as to damage her value as a wife. The morning is devoted to inspection. Altan's appearance must be flawless because she reflects her husband's status and power. Every detail matters. Her hair, worn in the elaborate braids and loops of a married woman decorated with silver ornaments that mark her as Noyan's wife, must be arranged precisely. The gold rings on her fingers must be polished. Her hands and feet must be clean, her skin unmarked. If Noyan is hosting officials or entertaining visitors, Altan will be presented briefly in the main chamber, her presence acknowledged, her beauty observed, and then she will be removed. The visit of a guest is an opportunity to display her, the way one displays fine horses or valuable silks. If it is an ordinary morning, she moves to the women's quarters, where she sits with Sorha, Noyan's eldest daughter from his first marriage, a girl only 5 years younger than Altan who resents her with a cold, adolescent fury, and with 2 other women, concubines of lower status than Altan but with more freedom than she possesses. The work of the household falls largely to servants, but Altan is expected to oversee it, to understand the inventory of goods, to make decisions about the winter stores and the provisions for summer. This is not unpaid labor. This is status work, the work that justifies her position as senior wife and validates her expensive existence. Sorha sometimes deliberately contradicts Altan's decisions to servants, testing her authority, undermining her with small acts of insubordination. Altan, knowing that her position is actually fragile, that she exists only by Noyan's continued favor, allows these small acts of rebellion to pass. She has already learned not to insist on her rights. Rights are something she no longer possesses. At midday there is a meal, usually simple. Bread, dried meat, sometimes cheese. At midday, Noyan may appear to inspect his household. to ensure that everything is being properly maintained. Or he may not appear at all, which creates a different kind of anxiety. Altan often feels the weight of her own invisible presence. She is in a room full of people, servants moving, family members speaking, soldiers passing through the compound, and yet she is permitted to speak only when addressed. She cannot initiate conversation. She cannot laugh loudly. She cannot express opinions. She has learned to become a pleasant object, to make her presence valuable by the smoothness with which she dissolves into the background, by becoming so unobtrusive that her husband forgets to think about her until he decides he needs her. There is another woman in the household, a concubine named Oyuna, perhaps 2 years older than Altan. Oyuna has been here for 6 years. She has borne Noyan a daughter, now 5 years old, who is being raised by servants rather than by her mother. Oyuna speaks rarely to Altan, but sometimes, when they are alone in the kitchens or the storerooms, she whispers fragments of memory. A sister she had, far away. A river in her homeland where she used to bathe. A song her mother taught her when she was small. She sings this song sometimes, very quietly, while grinding grain, her voice barely audible over the sound of stone against stone. Altan listens and adds new details to the fragments, elaborating the river, imagining the sister, reconstructing the melody. In these quiet moments, Altan is still Altan. In these moments, Oyuna is still Oyuna. In these moments, they are still human. But such moments are dangerous. One evening, Noyan passes through the kitchen and hears the singing. He does not stop. He does not forbid it explicitly. That is not his style. Instead, his mood becomes cold, distant, final. The next morning, Oyuna's daughter is moved to the servants' quarters. Oyuna is no longer permitted to visit her. The singing stops. When Oyuna looks at Altan in the days that follow, her eyes are empty in a way that Altan recognizes immediately. She is learning something that Altan already knows, that the price of remembering is suffering, that the price of being human is that the system will take your humanity from you, piece by piece, each time you dare to hold on to it. The evenings are Altan's most difficult hours. When darkness falls, Noyan will decide whether Altan is to sleep in his chambers or in her own room. If she is called to him, she knows what will happen. She has learned to accept it. She has learned to comply. She has learned that there are no words she can speak that will prevent it, and so she learns instead to exist somewhere other than in her own body. She thinks of the river Oyuna described. She tries to remember exactly how her mother's hands felt in her hair. She tries to imagine the voice of her younger brother, a voice she may never hear again. She becomes pregnant in her 3rd month, though she barely recognizes it at first. The sickness passes. She feels heavy. By her 6th month, she understands. By her 9th month, she is in labor, and Batu and an older midwife work through the night to bring the child forth. The pain is extraordinary, beyond anything she imagined. For the first time in months, Altan makes sounds that are not controlled, not performed. She cries out, and no one stops her. For those hours, her body belongs only to itself. The child is a son. Noyan is pleased. Altan has fulfilled her purpose. She has proven her value. She has become, briefly, essential. But that moment of essential value does not last. Within weeks, the body that briefly belonged only to itself is reclaimed. The rituals and abuses that define the existence of noble women in the Mongol Empire are not random cruelties. They are systematic, formalized, and embedded in the very structure of marriage and power. The most visible of these rituals occurs at the very beginning, in those first days after the marriage ceremony. In her first week in Noyan's household, Altan is taken to a private chamber where an older woman, a wife of superior rank, a widow, or sometimes a representative of the Khan's household if the marriage is particularly important, examines her. The examination is thorough and clinical. The woman checks that Altan is indeed a virgin, that she bears no marks of previous sexual contact, that she shows no signs of disease or damage that might indicate improper use. This inspection is not presented as humiliating. It is presented as practical, as verification. Noyan has paid a significant bride price for Altan based on her status, her family connection, and her presumed purity. The inspection ensures that he receives what he has paid for. During this examination, Altan is positioned, touched, questioned. She is permitted no dignity of reaction, and in those moments she fully understands, perhaps for the first time, that her body is not hers. It belongs to the man who has purchased her. It will be examined, assessed, and used according to terms she has never agreed to and can never refuse. Beyond the initial inspection, the coercive sexual use of noble wives in the Mongol system is constant and unremarkable. This is what marriage means. A husband has the right to his wife's body. The law makes no provision for a wife's consent because consent is presumed at marriage and then removed from her possession entirely. A woman cannot be raped by her husband because rape implies the violation of someone's autonomy, and a wife has no autonomy to violate. But there are forms of sexual exploitation that extend beyond even this normalized use. Some noble women, particularly those married to powerful men or whose families are important to the Khan, are displayed to visiting dignitaries as part of hospitality rituals. A visiting general or ambassador or regional leader is housed in Noyan's compound, and the Khan's protocols of hospitality sometimes require that the host's wife be presented to the visitor. The woman is displayed, to be looked at, to be conversed with, and in some cases, to spend the night with the guest. This is officially an honor to the visitor, a demonstration of the host's confidence and generosity. The woman herself is not asked whether she consents. Her presence in her husband's household is assumed to mean she accepts whatever role her husband assigns her. There are also, at the highest levels of the empire, cases in which the Khan himself or other members of the royal family demand access to noble women outside of their own households. A woman might be summoned to the Khan's palace for a night or for a season. Her husband cannot refuse without risking his position, his wealth, or his life. In some cases, the children born from these coercive unions are acknowledged and raised as legitimate, creating new power networks, new claims to status and inheritance. In other cases, they are hidden or denied, and the woman is left to bear her knowledge alone. These encounters are referred to in the chronicles as honors: the honor of serving the Khan, the honor of bearing his children. In reality, they are coercive sexual encounters justified by the authority of the state and the woman's absolute powerlessness to refuse. What Altan herself experiences, what countless women like her endure, is a more pervasive and perhaps more insidious form of violation. It is the constant surveillance of her body, her movements, her speech, and her thoughts. The monitoring of her menstrual cycle to ensure she is fertile and able to produce heirs, the denial of any privacy, the removal of choice in every detail of her existence, from the clothes she wears, to the time she wakes, to the work she performs, to the food she eats. She is not permitted to visit her family. She is not permitted to send messages home without her husband's approval. She is not permitted to speak to other women without supervision. She is watched constantly, assessed constantly, judged constantly. The message is clear. Your body is not your own. Your thoughts are not your own. You exist for purposes that have been determined for you. There is one moment, perhaps 2 years into her marriage, when Altan almost breaks. She is pregnant with her second child, and the weight and sickness and the loss of bodily autonomy, all accumulating, all relentless, nearly destroys her will to continue. She thinks of taking her own life. She thinks of speaking words of defiance that would result in her execution. She thinks of running, though she knows that flight is impossible, that she would be caught, that her family would be punished for her disobedience. She stands at the edge of the compound one night, looking out at the darkness beyond the walls, and she feels the possibility of escape like a physical thing, like something she could almost touch. But in the end, she does neither. She gives birth. She survives. She continues, because the alternative is death, and because something in her, something stubborn and animal, still wants to live. After this moment, Altan undergoes a subtle but profound shift. She stops thinking of herself as someone wronged. She stops imagining alternatives. She accepts the framework of her life as the only possible reality. She becomes efficient. She becomes compliant. She becomes, in some sense, complicit in her own subjugation, because the only way to survive is to stop resisting. She bears more children. She manages Nguyen's household with increasing skill. She teaches her sons the values they will need to maintain their position in the Khan's hierarchy. She becomes, in the eyes of the empire, a success. A woman who has fulfilled her role. A woman who has disappeared into the system so completely that she is no longer even visible as a victim. But what is striking about the Mongol system is that there was no need to hide it. There was no shame to conceal, no practice to deny or minimize. The Khan's court did not hide the systematic use of women as political instruments because shame would have required doubt, and the Khan's administration felt no doubt about what they were doing. The Yassa, the legal code compiled under Genghis Khan and maintained by his successors across generations, explicitly addressed the regulation of women, marriage, and inheritance. These were not matters of private morality. They were matters of state law. They were written down. They were formalized. They were, in the eyes of the empire, perfectly reasonable. The laws acknowledged that women could own property, could inherit wealth in certain circumstances, and could retain control of lands and resources even after marriage. This legal generosity around property was, in fact, more progressive than the legal traditions of many neighboring powers. Chinese law, Islamic law, and the customs of the Christian kingdoms of Europe all imposed stricter restrictions on women's property rights. The Mongols could point to these laws as evidence of their fairness, their rationality, their system of justice. But this legal generosity around property did nothing whatsoever to change the fundamental reality. Women's bodies and reproductive capacity belonged to the Khan, to be distributed, controlled, and used as state policy demanded. A woman could inherit her father's lands but could not choose her husband. She could manage an estate but could not refuse the sexual demands of her husband or the Khan. The legal system created the illusion of female agency while systematically removing any meaningful autonomy. Within the Khan's court, there were occasional debates about how to manage the system most effectively. As the Mongol Empire expanded across the Eurasian continent and incorporated diverse populations with different customs and traditions, regional variations in marriage practices and women's legal status collided with Mongol imperial policy. Some conquered peoples, particularly in the Islamic world and in China, had traditions in which women enjoyed greater legal protections, more autonomous control over property, or different roles in family structure. The Khan's administrators had to decide, should these local traditions be respected as part of the empire's policy of cultural accommodation, or should they be overridden in favor of the standardized Mongol system? The general answer across the 13th and 14th centuries was to override. The Mongols were confident in their system. They believed it worked. It created networks of loyalty that transcended ethnic and regional boundaries. It produced heirs with legitimate claims to status. It kept potentially rebellious regions tied to the center through family bonds that made rebellion against the Khan equivalent to betraying one's own blood relatives. Local leaders who benefited from the system, who received valuable women as brides, who could marry their daughters to Khan's generals and thereby gain prestige and power, had little incentive to resist the policy. There was little organized opposition to the system, because the system benefited precisely those people who had the power to organize opposition. There were, however, minor reforms and adjustments made by certain khans at certain times. Some rulers enacted rules limiting how many times a woman could be remarried after her husband's death, attempting to stabilize inheritance and prevent disputes over property and legitimacy. Some specified that a woman's consent, if it could be obtained without threatening face or loyalty, should theoretically be sought before a new marriage was arranged. Some rules were established attempting to protect widows and divorced women from destitution, but these reforms were marginal. They addressed symptoms while leaving the fundamental structure intact. They did not challenge the basic premise. Women had no right to refuse their assigned role. They existed as instruments of state policy, and any rights granted to them were granted only insofar as they did not interfere with their primary function. As the Mongol Empire fragmented in the late 13th and 14th centuries, as the unified Khanate split into competing regional dynasties, the system actually became less visible to outside observers, simply because the empire itself was less unified and less impressive. European observers in the 13th century had been horrified by accounts of the Mongol practice of systematically distributing women as part of political alliances. But as the empire aged and became more settled, as centralized control weakened, the practice continued largely unobserved by outsiders, absorbed into the normal operations of regional courts and local dynasties. What had been imperial policy became regional custom. What had been explicitly justified became simply tradition. What is most striking is that no significant counter-movement existed. There was no organized resistance, no religious or philosophical challenge to the system, no legal campaign to change the practice or defend women's rights. Why? Because to challenge the system would have meant challenging the foundations of power itself. The system benefited the powerful, the khans, the generals, the nobility, the men who controlled resources and territory. It benefited them economically, politically, and in terms of raw power. A woman could not rally against her own subjugation. Her father, her brothers, her husband, the men in her life, all benefited in various ways from her political value, from her fertility, from her controlled existence. To challenge the system would have meant those men renouncing power and privilege. It would have meant questioning the legitimacy of the empire itself. It was unthinkable. And so the system continued, largely unquestioned, largely invisible, until the Mongol Empire itself fragmented and lost cohesion. Only then, as centralized control weakened and regional leaders gained autonomy from the Khan, did some variations and modifications of these practices begin to occur. But by then, centuries of women had already been consumed by the machinery of empire. Altan lived to be 47 years old. By the standards of her time, she was fortunate. She was never summoned to the Khan's bed. She was never rejected or replaced by a younger wife. Her children survived childhood. She did not die in childbirth, a fate that claimed many women of her era. She outlived her husband, which granted her a measure of widowed authority over his household, a small freedom that came only because the man who controlled her was dead. She taught her sons the arts of leadership and politics. She saw her daughters married off to other powerful families, perpetuating the system that had consumed her. She became, in a limited sense, powerful. And yet, every day of her adult life was conducted under the absolute authority of another person. Every moment was controlled. Every choice was made for her. Every hope was subordinated to the needs of empire. This was not a tragedy of individual failure. This was not the result of bad luck or personal misfortune. This was policy. The Mongol Empire deliberately constructed a system in which noble women had no autonomy, no choice, and no recourse. And the system worked precisely because it was systematic. It was embedded in law. It was justified by religion and philosophy. It was normalized by generations of repetition. It was maintained by everyone who benefited from it. The deeper truth is this: civilization is not measured by how it treats its heroes, its soldiers, or its scholars. Civilization is measured by how it treats those with no power to resist. The Mongol Empire was vast, powerful, and sophisticated. It was also built on the systematic domination of women, children, and conquered peoples. These two truths are not contradictory. They are inseparable. When we walk through the ruins of Karakorum today, we are walking through the skeletal remains of an apparatus of control. The stone foundations, the carefully planned spaces, the architectural sophistication, all of it was designed, in part, to manage and monitor the people who lived within it. Noble women moved through these compounds as controlled entities. They were born into powerlessness, married into greater powerlessness, and died within it. The stones remember their presence, even if their names have been forgotten. And tourists walk across those stones without knowing that beneath their feet lies centuries of accumulated suffering, normalized and justified by the machinery of empire. What Altan experienced, the removal of choice, the reduction to an instrument of state policy, the normalization of violation, the slow erasure of self, did not end with the Mongol Empire. It continues in different forms in many places today. Women are still married for political alliance. Women are still reduced to their reproductive value. Women are still denied autonomy in the name of family, nation, and stability. What has changed is not the fundamental logic of the system. What has changed is mostly the language we use to describe it. The mechanism remains intact. It has simply become more invisible. Consider, how many women today are told that their primary value lies in their ability to bear children and maintain family stability? How many are told that their choices must be subordinated to the needs of the state, the nation, or the family unit? How many are married to secure political alliances or family advantage, with their own consent treated as a formality? How many live in conditions where their autonomy is systematically monitored and controlled, where every choice is scrutinized, where resistance is met with withdrawal of resources and support? The Mongol system is not ancient history. It is a mirror. If you believe these stories shouldn't be forgotten, if you believe that understanding how empires have systematized the abuse of the powerless is essential to recognizing when we are doing so today, then subscribe. Share this. The uncomfortable truths matter more than the comforting myths we tell about the past. Because understanding Altan's story is not about judging the 13th century, it is about understanding ourselves. And the women like Altan still exist. They are still waiting for someone to speak their names. They are still waiting for the world to understand that their suffering was not inevitable, not natural, and not necessary. It was chosen. It was policy, and it can be changed.